Welcome everybody to this online LSE public event hosted by the LSE's Global Health Initiative, the Institute of Global Affairs and the School of Public Policy. My name is Ernestina and I'll be the chair for this event, which is focusing on the pharmaceutical challenges posed by the pandemic COVID-19. The panel will be 4 people and we'll be looking at a range of issues related to the development and use of vaccines and treatments for COVID-19. I'm delighted to have our panel of 4 who will be presenting in the following order. Panos Kanavos from the LSE, Ken Shadlen, also from the LSE, Kalipso Chalkidou from the Centre for Global Development, and Margaret from Paris Tech. Each of the presenters will talk for about 10 minutes and then we'll open up to question and answers. When you do post your questions, it would be great if you could let us know your name and the institution that you're based in. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome our currently 191 participants to this event. Delighted but not surprised to see such a strong level of interest in this topic. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Panos Kanavos, who will kick off our panel. Thank you, Panos.
Thank you, Ernestina, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. What I wanted to do in this brief introduction is share some thoughts on the key issues regarding pharmaceutical innovation and access issues, and how these issues were shaping, or were in fact the order of the day before the pandemic, and how they are shaping right now. Just as a reality check, I think it's worthwhile reminding ourselves on the current status of treatments and vaccines in development for COVID-19. It looks as though we have about 223 treatments and about 141 vaccines. You can see here on the slide developments on antibodies, RNA-based treatments, vaccines, so about 141, and of which obviously some are promising, others are less so, others are in preclinical stage, others have progressed to a clinical stage in development, and so on and so forth. Overall, we have roughly 460 plus active ingredients in testing, of which about 313 in preclinical development and 150 have entered in clinical study. I think it's important to also understand that about 93% of pharmacological candidates have been approved for other indications. So in this particular case, we are basically talking about drug repurposing. Now, when talking about pharmaceutical innovation and access, I think it's important to link the issues around innovation, which obviously is the order of the day and a key factor in shaping market structure and conduct and performance in pharmaceuticals, but also the issues around intellectual property and monopoly. And obviously, when talking about intellectual property, whether this is relating to patents or relating to market exclusivity or data exclusivity, obviously there is a direct link with monopoly. But let's take this argument and look at how patents or other forms of intellectual property link to economic benefits. I think it is fair to say that patents are needed to stimulate innovation, and this is happening through profit streams of current patent exploitation. I think it's important to understand that the rights exclusivity typically results in monopolization and what we call supranormal profits. And if the attitude is towards excessive profits, then obviously some regulatory action can be justified, particularly in settings in Europe, in Japan, in Canada, but also elsewhere in the world. There are circumstances where we're facing institutional monopolies. In other words, the competent authority or the regulator is actually awarding monopoly rights to a particular type of treatment. So one could perceive, for example, orphan medicinal products and the orphan designation to directly or indirectly award such rights. There are also arguments about the patent life and whether a short versus a long patent life encourages innovation or imitation. So a long patent life could, for example, encourage imitation, whereas a short patent life may give an additional incentive for innovators to push the boundaries further and faster. I think it's important to reflect on that debate. There are some other issues of some concern as concerns the intellectual property, for example, issues around secondary patenting. For instance, there may be multiple patents for attributes of the same medicine, which accrue on the same molecule, the same basic molecule, for example, the pill size or the release mechanism. There may be extended release formulations. In the literature, we've seen quite a lot on evergreening, so generally, therefore, referring to strategies of obtaining multiple patents that cover different aspects of the same product. One example that I could refer to is idovodine, which was originally patented in 1964, but was shelved as an anti-cancer therapy, and a use was identified in the 1980s, in mid-1980s, as an HIV treatment, and a new patent was awarded. So there are, tricky issues around patenting, and of course that debate is extremely active in the not only in the literature but also in daily practice. Now, when we're looking at innovative treatments or new treatments that come to market, whether they are breakthrough innovations or incremental innovations, I think it is also important to reflect on what criteria decision makers need in order to allow a new therapy to be reimbursed. And you can see a list of things here, going from left to right and looking at the middle of the slide. You're looking at safety and efficacy. So these are typical regulatory criteria. But obviously we want effectiveness, in other words, measure of effect in real life conditions. We want efficiency. So we want basically look at the relationship between costs and effects, and we want affordability. So in other words, whether our healthcare systems can actually pay for such treatments. And there are important trade-offs here, and the trade-off relates to the monopoly right on the other side and the pursuit of profit in order to safeguard future innovation and encourage further innovation. And on the other side, the needs of healthcare systems to have effective, efficient, and affordable treatments. So this is the debate. And when we're looking at this debate in slightly more detail, we're obviously discussing issues around value assessment. So we want, for a new treatment, whether this is a drug or a codependent technology, a drug device, or it is in fact a vaccine, we want to look at the overall value and the benefits that this treatment brings to health and health gain. So looking at the left-hand side of the slide, so we do have approaches to value assessment around clinical and cost effectiveness. So in this particular case, we're looking at incremental cost effectiveness ratios, for example, as one of the benchmarks. But there are alternative approaches whereby, for instance, we're looking at comparative clinical benefit and therefore looking at how a new technology fares and compares with the existing one. So these are sort of strict criteria focusing on, in the first case, on a comparison between costs and effects. In the second case, looking at a comparison of clinical effects, the newer versus the older. But there's a whole host of other dimensions of benefit, for example, innovativeness, the issues around end-of-life criteria that we have in the United Kingdom, for example, other health benefits. We're looking at the extent of uncertainty, how certain or uncertain are the outcomes or the health gains that a new technology supposedly brings to market, equality and diversity, and a range of other social value judgments. We're putting all of these into a discussion. We're looking at the extent of uncertainty. And if uncertainties are quite significant and extensive, then obviously we mitigate the risks through the so-called risk-sharing agreements before arriving at a funding decision, which results in clinical or prescribing guidance. So it's a fairly complex function here by reimbursement committees, but also health technology assessment agencies if obviously health technology assessment agencies operate in certain settings. So value assessment, therefore, and the criteria underpinning it, quite a complex case altogether. Now, it's important to reflect on how the debate is shaping up during the pandemic, because in my mind, there are some pretty interesting and probably fundamental shifts occurring. And in particular, there seems to be an emphasis on equitable access to effective treatment. And we're talking about the likely new vaccines that will emerge, or the likely pharmacological treatments that will treat difficult cases of COVID-19, for example, on the one side, and the differential capacity to pay for it on the other. So, for instance, how does a country like Bolivia or Malaysia can benefit in the same way, because it has been affected in the same way as, for example, a country like Spain or Portugal. So, therefore, an emphasis on equitable access to effective treatment and a differential capacity to pay for it. So, how does COVID-19 change the debate? Well, look at the range of options here. For example, leveraging TRIPS flexibilities. So one could say, well, a new therapy, a new treatment, or a new vaccine, with a new vaccine, we could allow it to be produced on a compulsory licensing basis. So in other words, we are revoking the rights, the intellectual property rights of the originator. Or if the originator acquiesces, then obviously we're talking about a voluntary licensing process. Another way of looking at things is to say, well, here is an intellectual property pool where we pull together patent rights, regulatory test data, and other information to be shared for developing drugs, vaccines, and other technologies. Recently, we had the WHO endorsed resolution to create a voluntary pool for this type of information. Another way of looking at this is to say, well, we need to think about delinking, and delinking basically the cost of the treatment from the R&D. So we're looking there at options to improve affordability by considering innovations as global public goods in this particular case, and therefore rewarding innovators through prizes. And of course, there's a whole range of procurement options which can work on the basis of prizes or price volume arrangements, for instance, through pool procurement or through advanced purchase options. And I think it's probably one of the few times in the last 30 or 40 years that we are very actively thinking around relaxing some of the IP requirements in favor of providing access to, when it becomes available, effective treatment at an affordable cost across the board. So this debate, of course, started in the early 2000s with SARS, but I think as the current pandemic progresses, we're seeing more and more argument about some of these tools, which by and large interconnect with each other to come to the fore. So, Ernestina, I will pause here and look forward to the discussion later on.
Great, thanks Panos. And for those attendees who have recently joined, that was a presentation by Dr. Panos Kanavos from the Department of Health Policy here at the LSE. Next up, second in our panel of four, is Professor Ken Shadlen, Professor of Development Studies, also here at the LSE in the Department of International Development. Thanks, Ken.
Thanks, Ernestina, and thanks everybody for being here in your different time zones. So Panos started off with some slides about sort of the state of R&D in this space. I won't repeat any of this. There's clearly a lot of action. There's no vaccines or there's no treatments that have yet been approved yet. A couple have received emergency authorization use, but there's clearly a lot of action in this space. The concern I think that many people have is also, as Panos said, is about sort of the access to it, whether the activities that all this burst of innovation that's occurring, the activities that it's going to produce is who's going to get it and on what terms they're going to get it. One way that I think about this is that when I sit around at the breakfast table with my wife and daughter and we talk about vaccines and treatments, we talk about it in a binary sense of will there be one and when there will be one. But for billions of people on the planet, they're actually asking a different question. It's not will there be a vaccine, but if there is a vaccine, will we get it? And I say that not just sort of as a rhetorical flourish, the guy from international development, because I think that it both frames a lot of what I want to talk about today, but it's also, we've been there before. 20 years ago, when combination therapy came for HIV, it became a HIV became a treatable infection in the global north, when it was still a death sentence in most of the global south. And then what happened was there was a massive expansion of treatment in the 2000s across all regions of the world. And so what you see on the left is the green people are the people receiving treatment, and the right are is a graph showing sort of the increased treatment by regions of the world. Don't get me wrong, I mean, inequalities in access to HIV/AIDS treatments are not gone by any stretch of the imagination, but they're nothing like they were before. And you can ask sort of, how did this happen? And there's lots of, and the way that it happened is very relevant for the conversation we want to have today. Lots of factors made this happen. There were lots of actors involved, governments got involved, lots of firms. I listed a bunch here. There's so many things that have been written on this. There was even a film that was made about all of these actors and activists and celebrities and philanthropists and so on and so forth. But I actually think most of that stuff is the bells and the whistles. What really made it happen is what's on the bottom half of this slide. There were drugs that were of high quality and they were inexpensive. And they came from India. And it was the existence or the arrival onto the market in the early 2000s of inexpensive, high quality, antiretroviral drugs from India that essentially allowed that expansion of treatment that I showed on the previous slide to happen. Now, how did that happen? To understand how that happened, you sort of I need to take you down a very quick walk down what I'm going to call sort of pharma patent nerd lane. And this is, I won't spend too much time on this, but this sort of explains how this happened and what the challenges are now. This is probably the key money slide in the whole presentation. So the agreement that required countries to grant patents on pharmaceuticals, countries like India, was called the TRIPS agreement. Don't worry about that for now. It said you had to acknowledge inventions from 1995 onwards. Anything before that didn't matter. It's like the world started in 1995. But remember, and this is the third bullet point here, remember that the date of an invention, what I'm going to call the priority date, usually precedes the date at which a product is launched by about a decade. So what this chart has here is basically for every year from 1995 to 2017, the share of the drugs that were launched in that year that are based on post-1995 inventions. And what you see is that most drugs that came onto the market until the early 2000s, really till the first half of the first decade of the century, were based on pre-1995 inventions. This isn't just about HIV/AIDS drugs. This is about all drugs. So the share of the drugs that were launched in each year that are based on inventions that have dates that made them eligible for strong patents in India was 0 until the early 2000s and low throughout most of the first decade. So what does that mean? It means that it was very easy. I mean, maybe it didn't look easy at the time, but looking at it back, it was very easy for Indian firms to enter the market. Those drugs weren't patented. Now we're not in that world anymore. Now we're changing. The world is different. And what I want to do in the rest of the presentation here, and in the spirit of sort of the comparative perspective, which is what I titled this, I want to focus on 2 ways in which the current situation is very different from that previous sort of epidemic that was addressed in the early 2000s. The first challenge that I'm going to talk about is relevant to all drugs. So it's really a temporal thing. It's what's different about the world now that was different about the world 15 or 20 years ago. And the second challenge is a COVID-specific challenge. So the first challenge is sort of obvious. If you look at that chart, it's the same chart that you had on the previous slide, is that we've moved from a world in which we're talking about treatment in a world featuring drugs that do not have patents in India, and frankly, any other production capable country, or many other production capable countries, to a world in which virtually all drugs have patents now in India and in virtually any other country that can produce them. So the question that we have to ask is, what happens to access in a world of what I'm calling sort of quasi-universal patenting. And what I mean by that is that basically most drugs will have a strong patent in any country that can produce it. They may not have a strong patent in every country, but wherever it can be produced, it will have a strong patent. What does access, what does it look like then? So this in many ways is very similar to one of the slides that Panos has. And I'm going to try to talk through a few things. So what generally happens in this situation is that firms that have the patent will market the drug in each country, or they'll license production and the distribution rights to other firms. This happens all the time. Patent holders create and they manage networks of licensees and sub-licensees to manage the distribution around the globe. This can happen both direct, in that the patent holding firm can basically sort of write a license or agree to license with a producer, or it can happen indirectly through something like a pool, like the patent pool or the medicines patent pool, which is one that was created for HIV/AIDS. It now exists for other areas, including COVID, or something like the patent pool that's being contemplated around the WHO. Both of these things, whether it's direct or whether it's indirect through a pool, are voluntary. The firm does as it sees fit with its intellectual property. And both of these tend to exclude a lot of countries. So for example, at the top of this slide, I have a headline from Pharma, from Stat News Pharma, about how Gilead, which has a drug that's sort of the closest to getting approval, it's sort of at the front of the queue, but hopefully we'll get a lot better ones coming after that. But the one that's at the front of the queue, licensed with 127 countries, with about 5 or so firms to sell the drug into 127 different countries. 127 is a big number, but there's lots of developing countries, basically all of Latin America, that's excluded from this. And these are middle-income countries that have a lot of poverty. We think of, it's not just low-income countries that have poverty, but my colleague Andy Sumner's at King's College London across the road has shown that the distribution of poverty is heavily concentrated in middle-income countries. These are middle-income countries that are excluded, that are going through profound economic crises because of the same pandemic that we're all suffering from, and they have seriously constrained health budgets because of the pandemic as well. So this gets back to sort of the inequality and sort of the global development themes that I started with. Lots of attention is now going to compulsory licensing, which Panos mentioned as well. Compulsory licensing is essentially when the government lets somebody else sort of produce and distribute the drug without the permission of the patent holder. Compulsory licenses, for all of the attention that they're getting, to be useful, they require either that the country granting it has local production capabilities, or that there are external suppliers. And the fact is that few countries have local production capabilities. Not even many of the middle-income countries that are excluded from this licensing scheme that I'm using as an example have production capabilities. And if most of the local, of the capable producers globally are part of the licensing scheme, then they can't sell to those markets either. And then that second option isn't there as well. Last week, I got an email from a pharmaceutical firm in a Latin American country that's one of the ones that's excluded from this licensing scheme at the top. Not a tiny country, but is local production possible? The answer is no. Not even if the country were to have a compulsory license would they be able to produce the drug locally. And again, this is not a tiny country, but actually a fairly industrialized middle-income country in the region. So what they're going to do is they're going to try to get the firm, Gilead, to include the country in the licenses. Well, that's not going to happen. So they're going to go negotiate directly with Gilead to maybe become a local licensee. All right, try it. Good luck with that. The Ministry of Health is playing the same game. They're going to basically negotiate directly with the firm and try and get a price. The key point that I want to make is that in both of these negotiations, in a world in the absence of competition from external supply, in both these negotiations, the patent holder holds all of the power. So it's a fundamentally different set of challenges than the ones that we faced before. And my last slide, which is the second challenge, and here I'm going to wrap up quickly and I'm going to turn it over to Kalipso, who's going to go more into these topics, is that I think the second big challenge is it's that what we really care about right now, maybe even more than we care about price, what we really care about right now is we need a lot. Once we get something that's useful, we need a lot of it, and we need it quickly. We need massive scaling up of production of effective drugs, and we need it yesterday. Every day that we don't have it is another day that the economies are shut down. And here I think that sort of the role of licensing could actually help speed things up rather than slow things down, but the trade-off might be higher price. And that's something I'd be happy to come back to in the Q&A. And then the last thing I'll say before turning it over to Kalipso is that these challenges to scaling up and distribution are orders of magnitude bigger in the areas of vaccines than they are areas of treatment. If there's 5 million people on the planet that get infected, and say that every one of them needs to be treated, and say it takes 10 doses, we need 50 million doses of the drug, which is a lot to produce, but it can be produced. If we have an effective vaccine, we might need 10 billion doses of it. And we also need it really, really quick. So the challenges that we're facing in terms of the size and the speed of the ramping up of production is way, way bigger in vaccines than it is in treatment. And I'll end it there. Sorry for going over. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. I'm delighted to invite our third panelist, Professor Kalipso Chalkidou, who's the Director of Global Health Policy at the Centre for Global Development. Thanks, Kalipso.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So thanks, Ken and Panos, for setting the scene quite nicely. So I will spend a few minutes talking specifically about a vaccine, one that's being developed, or more than one that are being developed, as you saw, and ways in which perhaps we could think about access and pricing, given the obstacles and the particularities that Panos and Ken highlighted in relation to COVID. So let me see, I'm trying to, yeah, that's it. So let's start with what we're assuming in our discussions most of the time, the conversations around the development of a vaccine. So we believe, I think as a global health community, that we need a global solution to solve for the pandemic. And that means truly global. We can't work with only subgroups of countries. We can't rely solely on bilateral deals, which is what high-income countries, the United States, the UK, and others are entering in with companies, or indeed we can't rely on a solution that's audible, that's basically solvable through development assistance. So we do need to engage the US, we do need to engage China, ideally, to get to a global solution for a global problem. Secondly, the market is not predictable enough to work on its own at a fast enough pace, and Ken hinted on the importance of speed. So we should be really willing to pay for a speed premium. And at the same time, of course, we can't rely on industry to do the right thing, produce something, make it available to people at the right price or free or at cost everywhere that's needed. So that's not really a realistic scenario. And then finally, push funding alone cannot solve for a successful vaccine. We've got plenty of examples where grant money and portfolio selection shaping by countries alone and philanthropists have led to late stage failures. And the malaria vaccine, for instance, is one such example. The TB vaccine we haven't seen in detail yet, but again, it doesn't look as promising. GSK ended up licensing it out back to the Gates Foundation. And so in general, it's fair to say that the probability of success of an endeavor that's driven solely by governments is quite low. So we do need a truly engaging solution that engages the private sector, but also regulates, manages, sets out the rules of engagement with a view to ensure access. So we've put together, by we, I'm referring to the Center for Global Development, working together with colleagues at PATH, OHE, and other independent colleagues and academics, a proposal for an advanced market commitment, if you like, but it's also based on the benefit that the product brings about. And I want to emphasize a bit more this development, the middle development stage, which we seem to be forgetting quite a bit in discussions about vaccines right now. We talk a lot about early stage R&D and push funding grant money. We talk a lot, and rightly so, about manufacturing capacity and being able at risk to scale up manufacturing in a way that's platform agnostic, given that there's different types of product being developed. We talk about distribution rules and fairness, but we don't really talk about the profile of a product and how we're going to pull down the pipeline a product that has the right profile. So I'll just set out what we mean by benefits-based AMC, and I'm assuming that most people are aware of the advanced market commitment, the way it was implemented with the pneumococcal vaccine a decade ago or more. So first of all, back to the word global. It's a global problem and we need a global solution. So ideally, we want middle incomes to play here as well. It's not just about, for instance, Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia. We want also high incomes to engage, and we don't just want Gavi to solve for the developing country nations. Secondly, we can't rely on aid alone. So right now, there is potentially a significant pool, a significant market that private investors see in the context of high-income countries, but there's also significant uncertainty. There is a possibility that 2 years from now, there won't be an epidemic to deal with. The disease may well have become endemic, seasonal, or disappeared altogether. Already, we're finding it difficult here in the UK to recruit for a vaccine trial out of Oxford. So there are issues with the stability of a future market 2 or 3 years into the future. So we really need to cooperate and we need to work together also with the private sector. We need a solution that crowds in private investment. There's never going to be enough public money. I don't think governments are willing to commit to a single pool, a ton of funds in an inflexible way, whereby the funds effectively get committed, whether a vaccine develops or not, or whether the right product is developed or not. That's very problematic. We do need the private sector to come in, but we need them to come in a way where we signal to them as the public sector, as academia, as the people, the payers and the taxpayers ultimately, what to expect from them and how the rules of the game will be played once the right product or products are out in the market. So we do want to risk share, and we want to make sure that the private sector uses their own expertise and experience in shaping their portfolios, in making decisions about the winners, if you like. We don't necessarily want to let governments alone, civil servants or technocrats advising governments to make these decisions on their own. But the only way industry will do this is they believe that the risk will be compensated via a reward that's worth their while if they are successful. So of course there's pressure, as Panos said, on industry to deliver, but ultimately if they feel that this is too high risk, reputationally, for instance, to engage, then it's very likely that they won't. And the question is, are we willing to take that risk and say, well, it's okay, we'll just use public money and we'll own the product when it comes out the other side. And back to performance, I think performance is the missing middle in a lot of the conversation so far. So Ken mentioned pharmaceutical products. So far, the trials assessing the comparative clinical value of those products have been quite underwhelming. And I would advise the middle-income Latin American nation who's considering going to Gilead and bidding for access to their licensing scheme to think again and have a look at the trial results before they commit to a large innovation premium. So the importance of assessing value for one's own setting in a certain point in time, including 2 years in the future, is really important. So you could have a very good treatment, for instance, 2 years into the future, which makes paying for a vaccine less attractive. Or it could be that the outbreak is hopefully under control and we're looking at a completely different counterfactual. So that's important. And it's also important to recognize that value is local. And Panos mentioned local tiered pricing arrangements, pool arrangements, differential pricing. But ultimately, there could be a vaccine that perhaps is not the top candidate for the US or the EU, but because perhaps it doesn't require cold chain arrangements, it's actually the ideal product for countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. And so that's where that's what drives value for those payers, for those end users. And we need to be able to acknowledge the context sensitivity of any value assessment in the context of a broader market entry price or AMC or whatever it is we're trying to design as a global community. And then finally, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, governments are very averse to committing lots of funds up front without having a handle on exactly what it is they're going to pay at the other end. And I think it's really important, and what we're proposing is that commitments are guaranteed and underwritten, whether from multilateral development bank or government bonds in high-income countries or indeed Gavi, but they're underwritten subject to a product being developed that fits to some extent the target product profile WHO put out there. So ideally, that's going to be a lot more attractive, we think, to governments, as opposed to an arrangement where 20, 60, 170 billion dollars are asked from the high incomes mostly to be put on the table. And the idea is that something comes out and then we'll have to pay for it. That something needs to perform. We don't want to pay for things that are no longer of use to us, or indeed they don't deliver. So we put together something that's not a new idea. Early health technology assessment is used by companies all over the world, and it's used increasingly by payers as well. I'm quoting here a piece by HITAP, the Thai HTA agency, which looked at how much the Thai government ought to be willing to pay for a successful HIV vaccine, so it's hypothetical, given the potential value they'll be getting. And so we're proposing the similar exercises done using disease transmission models and health economics models that exist already, which then would allow countries to assess for different scenarios in the future, how much they ought to be willing to pay, given their budgets and given competing demands on their budgets for a successful product. So HTA is part of the mix. Underwriting I referred to, some arrangement, some global governance arrangement, which is relatively loose. I don't think it's politically feasible to expect the United States right now to operate under WHO allocation rules, for instance. For better or worse, that's what the reality we live in is. But the US is an outlier, is a big market, and ideally would want them to engage. Similarly for China, I think it's really important for all sorts of reasons. It would be a win-win also for those countries as well, despite their size and economic clout. And then finally, manufacturing and distribution in accordance to countries' own capabilities. And here it becomes really important to have manufacturing sites and manufacturing capabilities in developing countries, and in investing in those capabilities and scaling them up in order to ensure rapid access and fair distribution. So we've written quite a bit about this, and you can go to our website and have a look. We've blogged about it later last week. And I look forward to the conversation later on in the Q&A session. And also, please feel free to get in touch via email. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thanks, Kalipso. And just a reminder to all of our participants around the world, in advance of our final presenter, you can start to post your questions in now through the various chat functions. Please remember to put in your name, your institution if you have one, or which country the question is coming from. And could you make clear whether or not the question is for all of the panel to discuss, or it's for a specific panelist. Okay, without further ado, welcome to our fourth and final presenter. That's Professor Margaret Karl, who's Chair in Intellectual Property and Markets for Technology at Paris Tech. Over to you, Margaret. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this panel. The challenge of being the last speaker is that I have to find something to say that hasn't already been said before by my three very qualified colleagues on this panel. So I'm going to focus on something a little bit different. So far, our discussion has really focused on access issues for future treatments. Okay, so we're worried about getting a treatment, an effective treatment to market, and then thinking about how to distribute it as widely as possible. So can we learn something from what we've observed so far with products which are already on the market? So what we've seen with COVID-19 was that there's this unexpected shock to demand for a lot of different medical goods. So for ventilators, for PPE, for reagents and other materials for testing, and for a few drugs, even though there's nothing yet approved as a treatment for COVID-19, there's still lots of other drugs used in a hospital setting for those patients, whether it's to sedate people, for putting them on a ventilator, et cetera. So we have actually some products out there that we can learn from now. And what we've learned is that in addition to throwing lots of money at developing a vaccine, countries have also adapted their trade policies. So in some cases for the good. So in some cases, there's been a reduction in import barriers. So for example, removing tariffs on medicines. And I think that's something important to note here, is that There are many developing countries that still impose tariffs on medicines, on medical devices, even on soap. And many of them have yet to remove those tariffs in response to COVID-19. So there's sort of low-hanging fruit for improving access out there, and that's one example. Unfortunately, the other changes in trade policies that we've observed in response to this demand shock has been an increase in export barriers. And this one is much more problematic. So here, just to give you an idea of what's been going on, this is from the website Global Trade Alert, which goes through trade announcements by governments around the world and categorizes them as harmful or helpful, et cetera. So this is what Global Trade Alert has classified based on export bans or export restrictions, et cetera, in the pharma sector. And so you can see there's very little activity over the last decade until, whoops, we get the pandemic. And a lot of countries decide that they need to prioritize domestic patients, domestic supply. And so they put in export bans on various different pharmaceutical products. So some consequences in the short run, obviously, if you're an importer of those products affected by export bans in your trading partners, you're hurt. Very few countries are able to produce everything domestically. So you might be an exporter of some products, but you're likely to be an importer of another. And so while there's variation across countries in the extent of their dependence on imported products, probably everyone is going to be touched as an importer to some extent, and will be tempted to respond by putting in export bans of their own. There's also heterogeneous effects across goods, and in some cases, there's some unexpected ones. So sometimes an export ban that affects a key input can create shortages in products that are not subject to export controls. And so this can sort of have cascading effects. And I think something else that I'd just like to highlight here is, because we talked about India earlier in this panel as being basically a savior in the case of HIV by producing massive quantities of HIV medicines for Africa in particular. India, unfortunately, in this context, has put in export bans on, for example, hydroxychloroquine. So that turns out maybe not to have been that costly if the drug turns out not to have been that effective. But the fact that the export ban was put in there suggests that we can't necessarily look to India or any other country to be the savior in this situation. France and Germany, in general, are champions of free and open trade and very pro-Europe and building European unity, et cetera. Both of them put in export bans, or in some cases, requisitioned supply of products not even produced in, for example, France, just passing through France on their way to somewhere else. And the French government just tried to seize those products. So even countries where typically, we expect behavior consistent with appreciating global trade, et cetera, we've seen, unfortunately, a reversion to some rather bad policies. So there's a lot of blame to go around here, and I hope that this is short-lived and that we get past it soon. So despite the fact that we pay a lot of attention to IP, both as the incentive mechanism for inducing new treatments for COVID-19 and for others, as Panos said at the beginning, IP in this case is unlikely to be the best solution in a pandemic. We need things very quickly. We need a lot of money thrown at this very, very quickly. So there will be a lot of public research support necessary. It's not obvious that extending patent protection by a couple of years or expanding patent protection to a few more countries is going to greatly change the incentives to develop a treatment here. It's just not the relevant margin right now. But I think it's also important to realize that IP is also not the only barrier to access here. So we've already seen shortages occurring in non-patent protected products. And in fact, I think export bans by trading partners could ultimately be much more harmful to access to treatments in developing countries than patents. So that's not to say that they never matter. Most of my research focuses on patents, and I think they are important. But in this case, I think if we focus excessively on patents, we're going to miss opportunities to improve access through other policy changes. So even if we completely eliminated patents in the context of COVID-19 treatments, we would not have universal access without making some other adjustments. So I just like to wrap up here by pointing out that trade policy now could actually inhibit access to new treatments and vaccines in the future. So I think everyone is uncomfortable with the idea that we should just let the market play out. So the market will ration supply of a new treatment or a vaccine through price. And I think we all seem to be in agreement that that's not the ideal situation, that the ability to pay is very low in large parts of the world. And in fact, access to vaccines in those countries will still help consumers and patients in relatively rich countries, because it is a pandemic, it's global. So there's a risk that if we don't get it under control pretty much everywhere, it will eventually come back and hurt even rich countries, or hurt them more. However, I think protectionism as the alternative to the market rationing, the protectionist policies could ultimately be even worse. And so the export bans that we've seen, or requisitioning supply, or what's already started to be discussed is requiring priority access for domestic use. So threats that if a vaccine is developed by a firm located in a specific country, it's the patients in that country that get first access to the drugs. For these kinds of proposals or threats or saber rattling, whatever it is, potentially could be very problematic. So those kinds of policies may prevent supply from reaching the populations that most need the treatments. And it's also likely to induce similar kinds of behavior in other countries. So if you see the US behaving one way, your response might be to institute similar kinds of policies. And all of those moves towards protectionism undermine exactly the kind of global cooperation that Kalipso was talking about as necessary for whether it's an AMC or even enrolling enough patients in vaccine trials. As the number of infections changes from country to country, we're going to need help from all countries. We can't just do it in a single country anymore. Unfortunately, I think the kinds of moves towards protectionism are inhibiting our ability to achieve that kind of global cooperation. And that is what we need for the development of new treatments, as well as ensuring access to them. So let me end there, and hopefully I've left enough time for good Q&A.
Thank you, Margaret. That was great. So I can see now a whole stream of questions coming in from our 220 plus participants. Please do keep the questions coming. The way this is going to work is that I will read out the question and I will flag if it's for a specific panel member or for the whole panel. So the first question is coming in from Veronica Wirtz from Boston University School of Public Health. It's a question for Ken. Ken, she'd like you to comment on the situation of Bangladesh in particular. Do you think Bangladesh can become, in her words, the India of the 2000s, producing generic medicines to treat COVID-19?
Well, that's a great question. I think it's the right question to ask, because it's potentially about recreating the situation that we saw 15 or 20 years ago that allowed us to overcome or to increase expansion of treatment for HIV/AIDS. So it's a country that, because of the way the WTO rules are set up, is still allowed to not have pharmaceutical patents, and does it therefore sort of fill the gap left behind that India does. I don't know enough about, Veronica, I don't know enough about the Bangladeshi pharmaceutical sector to give you a really good answer to that, but I could say that I'm skeptical. And the reason why I'm skeptical is for two reasons. One is scale. And there are just a lot of really big Indian firms that have multiple production sites that can produce a lot of drugs. And they've been doing it for a long time, and they have, a long now period of experience of distributing drugs across the world. And it's questionable to me about the extent to which Bangladeshi firms could do this. There have been stories about a couple of Bangladeshi firms that are starting to say they're going to produce one of these drugs, and the number of doses that they're talking about producing are minuscule. So I'm just going to say that I'm skeptical, but I think it's a really important question to ask.
Thanks, Ken. The next question is for all of the panel. It comes in from Elise Racine at the Hertie School. And her question is that there's been more information emerging around how COVID-19 is disrupting routine immunization campaigns in low and middle income countries. She notes that the WHO's DG recently stated these disruptions might unwind decades of progress against vaccine preventable diseases. And she asks, how can this damage be minimized? And are such actions realistic given the COVID-19 health emergency? I'm going to go to Panos first.
I can only hypothesize that things might change, but it's difficult to respond. We're facing unprecedented circumstances, and we've seen in our own healthcare systems that we're not talking about vaccination programs. We're talking about healthcare delivery in some cases being put on hold for critical care or patients or cancer patients and so on. So I think it's we're experiencing unprecedented circumstances. But in principle, vaccination programs should not really be put on hold. I think we are ahead of the curve here. The big question will arise, obviously, if and when a new treatment, a satisfactory treatment comes about or becomes available, in which case some of the financial and access requirements will have to be managed appropriately. And it is there that we need the kind of cooperation that Ken, Kalipso, and Margaret have been talking about. And in fact, it has to be a kind of global cooperation in order to basically avoid those shortcomings and the risk of someone benefit versus someone else. So I think this is the kind of situation that we are facing now, and this is the kind of situation that unavoidably will emerge if and when a satisfactory vaccine or other treatment becomes available.
Thanks, Panos. Kalipso, would you like to respond to this question?
Yes, well, I'm not sure I have much more to add to what Panos just said. As he said, the impact, for instance, in this country on, say, cancer services, we've only just started to understand how we could quantify it, let alone quantify and express it in terms of years of lives lost, for instance. So there's significant indirect or rather non-COVID, but health effects of both COVID itself, of the perceptions of people, behavioral changes because of it, and then of the policy response, which a lot of the time, especially in lower income countries, seems to have been quite heavy-handed and very much COVID focused, assuming that everything else will carry on, which of course is not possible. So WHO guidance is suggesting that countries just do everything. So they do everything they should have been doing, which we know they weren't doing, plus do a lot more in relation to COVID. Well, that's really problematic. There are always trade-offs. And if it's politically insensitive to point those out, it doesn't mean they don't happen and people are losing out. So I think it's happening. I think because, again, unfortunately, data collection systems are very weak in most developing nations, very unreliable, because the global health community, again, courtesy of donors, have been investing heavily in modeling estimates as opposed to conventional prospective cohorts to establish prevalence, mortality, etc. We've been modeling mortality, we've been modeling impact. So now we have lots of models and it becomes a bit circular. We're modeling the R and then we're fitting it back into the model and modeling it again. And we don't really know, for instance, how many people are dying from COVID by age group in most developing countries. We don't know that, probably never find out. And let alone people dying from cancer or other causes. So vital statistics systems, again, we say it every time, we sort of come out and highlight how important this is, and then we move on to modeling all these issues again until the next time. So it's hard. Unfortunately, what doesn't get measured doesn't get much attention, and I think that's where we are right now. We don't really know. Excess deaths are not an easy thing to measure in most countries, let alone countries with weak data collection systems.
Great, thanks, Kalipso. I'm going to move on to another question. I can see we've got so many questions coming in from around the globe. The next question is from Jenny McDougall, who's at King's College in London. And her question, it's for the whole panel. I wanted to ask about the prize mechanism, as she calls it, where R&D could be rewarded in a way that is decoupled from subsequent drug prices or sales, with the treatments effectively becoming global public goods. How does the panel think this would work in practice? And do you see it as a viable option in the context of COVID-19? Or if not, what are the barriers? Do you want to raise your hand, any member of the panel who'd like to take this first? Panos, over to you.
Thanks, Jenny and Ernestina. It's a really tricky, this one. I just want to take us back to 2016. The argument about decoupling and global public goods, if the innovations being global public goods, is an old one. It's not a new one. And in 2016, it was included as an option in the report by the UN High-Level Panel on Access to Medicines. It's a really tricky question, this one, effectively because we don't have a manifested way of how decoupling would work in practice, how we would sort out the reward to the innovator. But I would assume, and looking at some seeds from the literature, I would assume we would be in a position to identify costs of R&D and add a premium, net cost of R&D and add a premium to a satisfactory premium to the innovator. This could work. Obviously, the devil will be in the detail because the issue is quite complex. Suffice to say that if we're looking at innovation per se and R&D expenditure, about 60% is private, and there is a 40% contribution from either the public sector, whether it is NIH in the US or MC, the funding agencies in Europe or in the UK or whatever, and obviously the voluntary sector. And we have to consider in that context discovery expenses. We have to consider development. We have to consider licensing and royalties. But in the context of COVID-19, and if we're talking about a vaccine, then obviously we're looking at manufacturing costs, and it is probably some of the manufacturing costs or elements of manufacturing costs that are quite significant in that context. And beyond thinking about the global public good and rewarding the innovator for the R&D expense, we also have to think about who is paying the bill for the significant manufacturing costs that a new vaccine, for example, would take and would require. So I'm sorry there isn't a sort of a straightforward answer, but it's a tricky one, and obviously the details need to be worked out.
Thanks, Panos. I can't see if any of the other panel members, I don't think anyone else is raising their hand to join in specifically on this. So let me ask a follow-up, I think linked question, but this is one that's come in specifically for Ken. And this is from Duncan Matthews at Queen Mary University. And Duncan asks, there has been a lot of discussion today about scaling up manufacturing, but where will the active pharmaceutical ingredients come from? And how can countries ensure that they are not overly reliant on importing APIs?
Well, yeah, that's a good question, Duncan. I mean, when I talk about production capability and scaling up production capability, I'm actually talking about APIs. I'm not talking about the ability of countries to have firms that can formulate the final products, which is a fairly easy thing that most countries have some producers that can do. I'm talking about actually the production of the APIs. So for me, local production capabilities and API production are almost synonymous. And the problem is that few countries have it. And fewer countries have it now than did, say, 15 years ago, because even India has less API production capability than they used to. One thing that I will say about this is that there are some countries that saw this problem coming around the curve a while ago. And so, for example, in Brazil, they've been trying to develop API production capabilities for about 10 years now, precisely because they saw around the curve that there was going to be a time in which they couldn't rely on India supply anymore. So I think that your question is a good question about, yeah, the way you avoid over-reliance on foreign APIs is to be able to produce them yourselves. But you don't get that capability just by snapping your fingers. It's a hard struggle.
Thanks, Ken. The next question has come in for the whole panel, from Rui Marquez Pinto, political advisor at Reutlingen municipality in Germany. And they describe their question as a simple one, but I will leave that to the panel to decide. What are the problems of individual countries looking for a vaccine against COVID-19, since we're in a context of the free market and competition? Kalipso, would you like to challenge this first? Not challenge, sorry, answer this first, sorry.
What are the problems of the countries?
To the issues, what are the issues for individual countries in a context of free market and competition?
Well, I mean, it's a number of things. That we've touched upon so far. So, for example, let's say Operation Warp Speed that President Trump launched. A lot of money, many possible winners. Now, there's lots of possibilities, lots of scenarios. So it could be, for example, that the companies the US is betting on, none of them comes up with the top product. Some come through, but they're suboptimal. And say China, the Chinese military, or somebody else gets the product. That's clearly problematic. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why you ought to be hedging your bets, because it's just not possible to bet on absolutely everybody and pull them through all the way, all 140 products. Even if you are the US, you can't take them all and manufacture them right at the end, block capacity of manufacturing, etc. So that's not going to happen. So you're betting, so you might lose. So that's one thing. Even if President Trump is betting on a winner or two, there's issues with API, with perhaps not glass vials anymore because they made a deal with BFS, but ultimately adjuvants. This is a global supply chain. So if you're going to want to have like 300, 600 million doses for your population in the US, it's not clear to me, certainly not a certainty, that you'll be able to produce all the adjuvants, all the raw materials, if you like, in the US. So at some point you might need Brazil to help, or China to export something to you. And that will be, again, very problematic when you're playing that game of bilateralism or unilateralism, even one country and a company or a group of companies. And then there's the issue again of pulling your purchasing power with others, also to draw down the pipeline, something that's worth paying for. So you're signaling to them, you're saying, well, I'm going to pay for this, but I want the minimum WHO TPP to be met, which is where our proposal comes in. So we're saying it's not just about getting any product out the door. You want a product that works, right? And then there's, of course, issues of manufacturing capabilities. And again, the US probably able to manufacture, maybe, I don't know, it depends on the platform. But ultimately, they'll have, for that speed premium, and irrespective of the performance of the product, they'll have to invest at risk and ex ante block out manufacturing capacity across different types of platform, and hope that some of the winners that are coming through are the platforms they've already reserved capacity for, are fit for those platforms, and they're going to be mass produced. So, and of course, the most important thing, the virus cannot sort of be controlled by border controls, and however good the immigration officers are in the United States, people can still come in, and ultimately trade and people movement is the basis of a capitalist economy such as the US is. So how long will they remain locked in unless they share? So it's a global problem, and we need a global solution. There's no other way. There's no way around it.
Thanks, Kalipso. I'm going to jump on to another question. So sticking with that global aspect, this is a question that's come in for Ken from Kofi Nazar, who is an LSE alum, who makes the point, local manufacturing has existed in sub-Saharan Africa now for quite some time, but the technological capabilities of many of these firms remain very low. So Kofi is asking a broader question about what do you think has hindered technology transfer over the years, or in his words, stunted technological innovation and what can be done to solve this problem, specifically in the context of COVID-19?
That's a challenging question, and I'm not sure how good of an answer I'm going to be able to give to that. It's very similar to the previous question that I got about the difficulty of local production capabilities. I'm gonna try to address it from a different angle, and I'm going to say that part of the ability of producing the APIs depends on the characteristics of the API itself. Some are actually fairly easy to produce, and then it's just a question of whether the country has a certain amount of technological capabilities to reverse engineer it. Some are very difficult to produce, both because the synthesis in itself is very complicated and because the amount of raw materials that you need and supply chains are very complicated. In which case, it's not really there's a lot of know-how there that you may not be able to develop on your own. And so I think that for some traditional drugs, it's a question of investing in the technological capabilities over a sustained period of time to be able to reverse engineer simple small molecule chemical drugs. And for other drugs, you're going to have to work with the innovator itself, because they're the ones who have the know-how for how to produce the drug and how to manage the supply chain. And so I'm not sure that really addresses the question as directly as the questioner wants, but I think that, and I don't have a global answer for why technological development became stunted in that sector, in that region of the world. But I think that it's, what I'm trying to say here, and this sort of links to what I was trying to get to in the very last slide of my presentation, is that for some drugs and vaccines, the challenges are greater than our traditionally way we think about reverse engineering of drugs.
Sorry. Thanks, Ken. I'm going to next move to a very broad, let's call it the crystal ball question for the whole panel. And this is a question that's come in from Keith at King's College. And he asks, assuming the pandemic is over, what would you recommend countries or international organizations do differently in terms of pharmaceutical regulations to prepare for the next pandemic? I can see the whole panel smiling wryly at that question. If I may, let me ask Margaret to respond to this first. Thank you.
So I think the most obvious lesson from this is probably to manage stockpiles of necessary goods. So that can be very simple things like PPEs, maybe it's ventilators, et cetera, but certainly having some kind of strategic stockpile, that seems the most obvious lesson to learn here. I think the other lesson is that it's not so much importing that is the problem. The problem is being too dependent on a single source of any key input. So whether that's domestic or whether it's foreign, that is problematic. So I think what we probably will see is an effort both at the firm level and at the national level to diversify supply sources. Again, it's not realistic for every country to be able to produce at the local level, domestically produce APIs across the board. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, most countries won't have that capability, and it wouldn't make sense. They would be, if they had it, it would be at higher cost than what we could achieve by engaging in global trade. There is a problem with being overly dependent on a single country or two countries for the source of everything. So greater diversification, I think, is the other key lesson here. And I guess the third lesson I hope that we take away from this is that, again, the turning inward and immediately putting up protectionist barriers is undermining global cooperation. And for something like a global pandemic, this is really where we need global cooperation. So maybe put in more institutional, strengthen the global institutions that we have, rebuild trust in them, because clearly that's an issue. And hope that next time we'll be better prepared to address it together rather than everyone reverting to, okay, I'm going to put in an export ban, you're going to put in an export ban, and then we have to work on undoing this through bilateral negotiations rather than just getting rid of the barriers to begin with.
Thanks, Margaret. Your answer really makes me mindful of the news story about how Addis Ababa is emerging as a really important hub in the south-to-south transfer of COVID-19 products to prevent seizure of products from some countries. Who else on the panel would like to respond next to this crystal ball question about what next? I can see no hands raising, so I will nominate. Oh, Panos, well done. Over to Panos. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Ernestina, and I think it's a really good question because it forced us to think about how the future might plan out in this particular area, which is guided by IP rights, is guided by intense regulation, it's guided by fragmentation and so on. So if we are in a position to do away with elements of fragmentation, then obviously I think we would achieve a lot. If we were in a position to cooperate better at global level, then we'd certainly achieve a lot. And I know it's a little bit problematic to raise this, if some of the international organizations and agencies can take a bigger role in this particular context, and let's say move away a little bit from their global, from their convening power, and perhaps get us a little bit more to collaborate. I think that would go some way into addressing a future pandemic in a better way. We're looking at regulation as well. By and large, whether you are in the United States or in Europe or in Japan, in Canada, in Australia, in Brazil, in Egypt, and so on, we regulate medicines in a similar way. So we're looking at safety, we're looking at efficacy, we're looking at quality. So strengthening that process obviously is a requirement for many countries. Going to call them countries in the South, that's absolutely fine, but certainly there needs to be an approach there. But there's no reason why we shouldn't be harmonizing or even standardizing standards at global level, and having a sort of a more rapid response. Equally, from an IP perspective, perhaps I think it might be worthwhile to come together as a global community and address the challenges of let's say profitability on one side, which is obviously coming through monopolization and so on and so forth, versus the need to ensure that we have equitable access. Again, easier said than done, but I think some of the shortcomings and some of the debate points that we've been hovering around clearly need addressing. And I think going forward, whether it is global regulatory standards or, let's say, a renegotiated TRIPS flexibilities or some other arrangement to address explicitly the concerns around the pandemic, could become I wouldn't call it the bedrock, but probably could give us an opportunity, let's say, to shape things differently for the future.
Thanks, Panos. Ken, would you like to respond to this question?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. And I mean, I agree completely with the 3 points that Margaret put out at the beginning of this question. And particularly the second point about diversifying your source of imports. And if I came across as saying that all countries should become self-sufficient in all API production, then I didn't mean to say that, because that's obviously would be both impossible and wasteful. But I will say, I just want to make 2 quick comments here. One is that countries, because of their distinct disease profiles and distinct characteristics of their needs and their healthcare systems, they can identify the particular areas of vulnerability and invest in those in developing capabilities in those areas. And that's a lot different from saying every country becomes self-sufficient across the whole spectrum. And the other point that I want to make, which I think is hopefully maybe the sort of the abiding memories of this, and I know it's too early to talk about the memories of the pandemic when we're still stuck really in the beginning stages of it, because we haven't have any drugs or treatments yet or vaccines yet. And that is that it's really driving home the importance of the interface between sort of health policy and economic development and industrial policy. And I don't mean that just in the way that we see every day in the fact that, our economies are stalled because we're dealing with a health crisis, and so these things are related, but also in the sense that a lot of the ways that countries can respond to this crisis and the challenges depend on having a vibrant industrial sector. So these 2 things, I think, are much more related in ways that people have appreciated in recent years. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Kalipso, would you like to make a final point on this? I know before you need to leave this event.
Thanks. No, I think I think this particular question has been covered. I think I'm sure there'll be a lot of conversation about global governance as well, more generally, once this is sort of over in any way it could be deemed to be over. And I think it's important to think about the governance arrangements that follow this crisis and what the implications may or may be on different countries. So we've already seen in draft proposals in the US for establishing a president's response to outbreaks office under the State Department, which will take up some of the USAID budget and some of the COVID response budget globally as well. There have been calls by Australia and others to review WHO's behavior vis-a-vis China. Here in the UK, the Foreign Committee have called about a month ago for a G20 function that's responsible for public health and outbreak surveillance. Internally, we're seeing a new office being set up in the UK to oversee response, headed up by somebody who is likely to become the next head of MI6, with Public Health England perhaps not playing such a central role going forward, more of a securitized response approach, if you like. So who knows what's going to happen, but things will change dramatically, I think. And I hope that we're able, through this platform and others, to reflect on possible scenarios and perhaps perverse implications of governance arrangements and decisions taken in the aftermath that may affect us all and for many decades to come. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Kalipso, and thanks so much for your input on today's panel. Moving on to another question. This question has come in from Rachel Arundale from the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Authority, and someone who formerly worked in DFID on global health policy. Her question: I'm interested in any view from the panel about the optimal role of regulators in countries such as the UK to ensure the development and use of a safe and effective vaccine. And how can high-income countries support low and middle-income countries in any regulation? Who'd like to go first in responding to this? Margaret, Ken, or Panos? You want to show by raising a hand? Otherwise, I'll just unmute somebody. I'm going to unmute Ken. I can't unmute Ken. Ken, could you unmute yourself, please?
I am unmuted, actually. In some ways, I have to say I'm probably the least equipped of the three people to be addressing this question, because I don't do much work on regulatory agencies in the UK or in Europe. So I'm gonna disqualify myself from answering this.
That's fine. Panos's hand has gone up. Panos, over to you, and then Margaret, if you'd like to follow on from Panos, just raise your hand.
Yeah, tricky one, this one, but I think agencies such as the EMA, obviously the MHRA here in the UK, and the FDA, not to discount Health Canada or the or TGA in Australia and Japan for that matter, do actually take the lead in. I wouldn't call it regulatory science, but in the application of the standard that we have, it is quite clear, and I think probably a shortcoming of our global system, that developing countries or low and middle income countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, do have significant needs to improve their regulatory standards. I was recently means about 6 to 7 months ago, privy to discuss developments in Central Africa. It's an effort by the regulatory agencies of 4 or 5 countries. It's called Zazibuna. I don't know if the acronym rings any bells with anyone on the in our virtual world here, but it is basically an effort by several countries to coordinate their actions in order to improve standards, in order to share experiences, and in order to see what can be done better, faster, and more optimally, also sharing responsibilities. And in that context, agencies, whether they're in Europe or North America or Asia, can help quite a lot in terms of sharing standards, in terms of showing how to do things effectively. The regulatory needs may change, and they may change significantly. We have significant challenges in terms of new treatments, but also in the traditional treatments that do not necessarily require all that armamentarium that we have and we are implementing across the board. So, and I recall that several years ago, WHO did have a project on requirements for small regulatory agencies in order to improve their performance, in order to improve their standards, in order to upgrade the standards they implement, and so on and so forth. But I don't know what has been happening in the interim. So I suspect there may be quite a lot in terms of reducing the fragmentation and bringing some of the needs of these regulatory authorities up to certain standards, and obviously the standards that we subscribe to in this part of the world, if that is can be perceived as an answer. But I see quite a lot of opportunity there. Thank you.
Thanks, Panos. Margaret, is this a question you'd like to respond to? I'm aware that we've got just over 5 minutes left on this panel and a ton of great questions still waiting to be asked and answered.
So then I'll be extremely brief. First, I don't think that the FDA has necessarily provided a shining example for the rest of the world in the last few months. So maybe there are some things to learn, but maybe also learn from mistakes that we've seen in high-income countries as well. I guess the other point that I'd like to make is I think too much of the burden of ensuring quality has fallen on the FDA and the EMA and basically the big regulators, and they simply don't have enough resources to be reviewing to examine all of the manufacturers in a global supply chain, right? So I think that there's a risk that even in high-income countries that quality is an issue because inspections are less frequent or not as thorough or not a surprise or something like this. So this is not just a high-income to low-income country transfer of knowledge. This is, again, a global issue that we should all be discussing and worried about.
Thanks, Margaret. I'm going to follow that swiftly on with another question from Shane McMahon, who is a resilience consultant at Horizon Scan, to the whole panel. Do you think that the pharmaceutical companies see COVID-19 as a long-term business opportunity rather than a crisis? Ken?
I mean, all of the above. It's both, and it doesn't have to be one or the other. I think it's clearly both. They wouldn't be throwing tons and tons and tons of money and resources into it if they didn't think there was a business opportunity. But they also wouldn't be throwing tons and tons of money into it so fast and therefore abandoning other lines of research that gets suppressed if they didn't also see it as a crisis. So I see it as both and don't necessarily see those two as sort of tragically in conflict either in this case.
I see lots of nods and smiles from the other two panelists. So unless I see a raised hand, I'm going to assume that there isn't a different answer to the one that Ken has just given. And I want to maximize the number of questions that we are asking. A question came in from Eric Bergloff here at the LSE, asking the panel to reflect on testing, which he notes hasn't been mentioned at all in the presentations or the discussion. Panos, would you like to, or Ken or Margaret? I'm in the interest of speed and time.
Testing means obviously following up and maximizing. I think it's essential. I think it's essential. I think as we move from a situation of lockdown to a situation where we're gradually opening up, and given the severity of the situation, testing is absolutely essential. On the understanding that obviously we use the proceedings of that to make decisions about the dispersion of the disease, following up, and basically the whole armamentarium that we have in terms of tracing, identifying new cases, and so on and so forth. I don't just reflecting on a likely second peak. I don't think that the global economy can afford a second yes, we can afford a second peak, obviously, but we cannot afford a situation where we have continuous lockdowns in large parts of our economies and societies anymore. I think it's becoming, it is going to cost us dearly, and unless we keep testing following the disease, it's we're leaving far too much to chance.
Thanks, Panos. I'm going to move to another question. This question has come in from Kate Marr at the LSE, who asks, is it wise to press less developed countries with currently very low death rates from COVID-19, but they have many other more pressing health issues as well, why should costly health priorities of more developed countries be financed by less developed countries with other competing priorities of their own? Margaret, Ken, or Panos? Would anybody like to respond to this question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I see anybody pressing anybody to prioritize this. I think countries will set their own health priorities, and if they want to use their resources to treat other conditions rather than treat COVID, I think that's going to be an autonomous choice. I haven't seen countries being pressed to do this. I think that one area where you might make the case that even where that this might seem like a pressing thing is precisely that it's global, and that basically people travel, and that if the COVID is not captured or controlled in one country, it can easily spread around the globe, which is different because it's so contagious, and it's different than a lot of the other drugs, a lot of the other conditions that we're dealing with. So you could make the case that this is a global priority and therefore countries should be pressed to do this, but I actually haven't seen much evidence that countries are being pressed to prioritize this over their own healthcare concerns. Remember that right now there are no treatments, there are no vaccines. Nobody's being pressed to spend a dime on anything because nothing to spend on.
Thanks, Ken. And mindful of the time, I've got one final focused question for Margaret, which has come in from Rory Horner from the University of Manchester. The question: to what extent do you see export bans and protectionism in medical industries as being limited by the fact that drugs and vaccines are produced through global value chains? If I could ask you to answer in 30 seconds or less. Sorry.
Well, I hope they are limited. Almost everything now is produced through global value chains, so it's not that that this is more of a problem or more of a limitation for medical goods than for many other kinds of products. Again, my point was this is the response that we've seen over the last few months. Undoing that, well, first, when one country does it, that induces other countries to engage in similar behavior, and undoing that on a bilateral basis or even through multilateral discussions, that takes time. And it's unfortunate that that it was done in the first place, because it does really have supply consequences in a short period of time. And this during a pandemic, we don't have time to sort this out.
Which neatly leads me on to the fact that we are absolutely out of time for this public event. Thank you to the 4 panelists. Thank you also to the 230 plus participants who joined us live for this event. So thank you, everybody. We had way more questions than we had time to ask, but I think that just begins to give us a hint of the interest and the importance of this topic. Thank you, everybody.